His dream is to change the world for the better, and he has the means to do it. But he's not without his critics, and his views are often controversial. In one day, he made over $1 billion through a deal that devalued the British pound sterling and earned him the nickname the man who broke the Bank of England. Politically, he was instrumental in the collapse of the Soviet Union, and he worked tirelessly to block President Bush from gaining re-election. Hello, I'm Ernie Manouse. Coming up on InnerVIEWS, our conversation with businessman, economist, and activist George Soros. When you dream at night, what do you dream about?
I don't really remember too often, so I can't really tell you.
What are the hopes that you have for the future then?
Look, I explore the limit of the possible, what can be done. I think that there is no, utopia to be reached. It's a constant striving for improvement, and we are at a rather critical moment because our power over nature has increased, whereas our ability to govern ourselves has not. And so we now have this tremendous power for good or bad, constructive or destructive. And there is really a serious danger, in my view, that we are going to destroy our civilization.
So why do you not get involved and take the traditional route, get involved in politics as an elected official? Why do you choose to stay outside the fray?
Well, I don't think that I would make a very good elected official, and I am very much engaged in the political process. I was very much engaged in the rest of the world, particularly in the former Soviet Union, and in the last few years I've become much more engaged in the United States because I stand for an open society, a society that recognizes that nobody is in possession of the ultimate truth, but we need to strive towards it. And therefore we need a democratic government, a market economy, rule of law, and so on. So it's a belief in democratic government. It used to be, it's called liberal democracy, if you like. And that is what I stood for in other countries. And then, to my greatest amazement, America, which is the most successful, most powerful open society in the world, the principles of open society have become endangered. So I felt that I have to redirect my efforts towards my own country, and the country that I've chosen to be my country.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think that's changed? Why do you think our society has started to have this shift?
Well, I think it's a political development. A group of extremists, I think, have first captured one of the major parties, and then the executive, and now are in the process of perhaps capturing the legislature, the legislature first, now the judiciary. And there was one more hardliner on the Supreme Court, and I think all the checks and balances that have been the hallmark of American democracy may be fatally weakened.
In your opinion, is there evil? Is there evil in the government? Are there evil people, or are there people that have what they believe to be true and they're fighting their truths? It just doesn't go with what yours are.
Well, using the word evil is a dangerous thing to do, but I'm afraid this may be true, and it's not President Bush. I think President Bush is a man of good intentions. I think Vice President Cheney, when history is written, will be seen as a very dangerous kind of personality.
What would make these people be defined as dangerous? What is it about, as you say, for the vice president? Why would he not have the best interest of the country at hand?
Well, I think by his own lights, he's doing what he thinks is the best interest in the country. But I think he suffers from some kind of persecution complex, or he sees enemies all over the place, and I think that he uses methods of dealing with those enemies which are contrary to the principles which have guided this country.
If you were in that position, or in the president's position, how would you have handled everything that's happened in the last few years differently?
Well, I think where we went wrong was with the war on terror. You know, President Roosevelt said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And compare that with the way this administration has reinforced a very real fear that the terrorists have created. I mean, the 9/11 was really a truly traumatic event that shook us all. But instead of calming people and say, this is not the end of the world, the administration went out of its way to actually to reinforce that threat. And Vice President Cheney was talking next time is going to be in the form of a mushroom cloud. Mm-hmm. So that's enhancing the danger. In order to gain the support of the public for whatever they may be doing, and in order to make any kind of criticism of their policies unpatriotic. And that is in fact what happened for about 18 months after 9/11. There was not a critical voice. And that is what enabled them, allowed them to carry out their policy, which was then turned into a disaster, because that's how we got into invading Iraq.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about all of this, though, I know you also make reference to the fact it reminds you of during your childhood, when a lot of this was going on in the rest of the world and with the Nazi occupation and
yes,
stuff.
Because I've seen that, and I remember, the Nazi propaganda, how they whipped up public support. Because let's face it, Hitler had the support of the German public, similarly exploiting fear. In the Soviet Union, there was the murder of Kirov that allowed Stalin to engage in purges. In Germany, it was the fire in the Reichstag, in the German parliament, that allowed Hitler then to put down his opponents. Now, this is not what has happened here. I mean, we are a democracy, right, and there are rule of law. So, I mean, this administration can't do that kind of thing. But the propaganda was very similar.
From a personal point of view, what do you remember of that time? I mean, it's easy to talk about the history of what was going on, but as a small child, what do you remember?
Well, I wasn't such a small child. I was 13 when the Germans occupied Hungary. And being Jewish, I would have been deported like others. And so I remember that very, very vividly. It was the formative experience of my life, 1944. Right. It really has, I think it has shaped me for the rest of my life.
What was the fear of that like, though? What is it like to know the people around you are, in a sense, coming for you? How does that feel?
You see, we were in a very unusual position because my father had lived through something similar in the First World War, where he was prisoner of war in Siberia, and he led an escape. and he got caught up in the Russian Revolution, in the fighting in Siberia. So he came back with a very different kind of experience from normal life. And because of that, he was much more prepared for the German occupation. And he said, this is not something you can take lying down. You've got to take evasive action. So he arranged false identities for all of us, and we all lived through it. And my father helped a lot of other people also to survive by giving them, securing them safe homes and so on. So it was sort of a really dangerous life, and of course people were fearful, and in fact many people perished. But we succeeded in surviving. So this is something that makes me want to stand up when I see something dangerous happening, and instead of lying down.
Right. So at what point did you say, I am going to make something of myself? Was there a moment where you realized you could do more?
Well, I think as a child we all have great ambitions.
Right.
And then, and of course the living through that very dangerous time, it was like that movie, the dangers of the Ark or something. There's an adventure movie that
Raiders of the Lost Ark.
That's the one.
Yeah.
It was a little bit like that. After that, actually, it was a big setback because I went to England, and it was very difficult conditions. It was a big come down. I thought I was very important, and nobody paid any attention. So it was a slow climb up again. And eventually I came to America, and it's really in America that I've been successful.
Yeah. Do you remember your first paycheck? Do you remember the excitement of earning your first dollar?
Well, yes, but I worked in all kinds of odd jobs in England. I worked under picking fruit, painting walls, and so on. So it was a very hard life. I was a waiter. That was my best job. and then I studied and got through college, and it went off.
What was it, do you think, in your personality that allowed you to achieve the great success that you've made?
Well, I think that my father had a lot to do with it. I mean, he was a sort of very much a leading light, somebody whom I very much relied on and absorbed. And I think also the adversity of the German occupation and the danger, which enabled me afterwards to take risk, but never to take too much risk. In other words, to confront risky situations, trying to minimize the risk. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, was very useful to me in the financial markets.
Yeah. Did you always have a head for finance?
It started actually even during 1944 when I was 14 years old. My father used me to do the currency transactions because a boy wouldn't be sort of suspected of carrying dollars or gold.
Yeah. There is a story of you making $1 billion in one day. Mm. And with it comes the question for me, can you be a normal human being when you're dealing with those amounts of money? And the reason I say this, does everything stay in perspective when in a day you can make what most people will never even imagine what that's like to have?
Well, it is actually kind of tricky because on the one hand you get used to dealing with very large amounts of money. On the other hand, you have to make decisions about smaller things like, how much do you tip the taxi driver. Frankly, I try to use the same criteria on small things as on large things. So I don't sort of lose contact with reality in everyday life. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, I don't have a private plane because I don't think I need one. So you are right in saying it's difficult to maintain perspective, and it's important to sort of not lose sight of what's right and wrong.
As your bank account went up, did your values change?
I don't think so. I really don't. In fact, I think I'm pretty strongly anchored in my values, and you see, when you have a lot of money, you are under an obligation somehow to flaunt it, and I don't feel that obligation. Now, what I have done is I've set up a foundation, and where I really do spend a very large amount of money. Our annual spending is over $400 million. So there again, I deal with very large amounts. But when it comes to personal expenditures, I don't deny myself anything, but I also don't, splurge unreasonably.
Yeah. When you decide to help out an organization or a group or find a charity, how do you decide what are worthy of your time and effort and your money?
Well, it's since there's an infinite amount to be done.
Right.
You have to focus in, and I'm led by this certain philosophy, this philosophy of open society, and it helps me to decide what falls into our bailiwick and what is outside. It changes, though. For instance, we did not deal with anything to do with the environment. I thought other people know more about it. It's too much for me to take on. I've changed, actually. It was actually Al Gore's presentation that convinced me that global warming is a major issue for humanity. It's not just an environmental issue, it's a kind of a civilizational issue or existential issue. So I've become involved in global warming. So our activities shift, but they have a clear focus based on a certain philosophy, which has guided me both in making money and in spending it.
Mm-hmm. I would say a lot of people would say that you fall into the Democratic Party if you had to choose a party. Do you pick a party? Is there a place that you're...
I mean, I am inclined towards the Democratic Party, but I wasn't particularly active in politics until I felt that the very principles of democracy in this country are at risk. And that's when I became much more engaged.
A couple years back, Michael Moore spotlighted the Carlyle Group. And I'm curious if you feel there are misconceptions out there about who they are, what they do, and it's a financial group that involved the Bush family and also the bin Laden family.
Well, it's a good point you raised, because I was one of the original partners of the Carlyle Group
Right.
in one fund, and I had no problem with that. I think that they are perfectly reasonable, sound businessmen. Of course, their strength is on defense, because that's where their connections and their knowledge is. They actually asked me to speak at their annual gathering, which is also addressed by Bush and others, Cheney and others, Rumsfeld. And I said, you don't really want that, because you want to get defense contracts, so you don't want to give me a platform. And they said, no, we do. And I spoke to them, and I spoke to them the same way as I speak to them at any other forum. So it just happens to be that they are, I think, very fair people politically as well.
When you make a business decision, is it void of your moral standings, or can the two of them coexist?
Well, it's a difficult thing, because as long as you are a small investor, somebody anonymous that can't influence the market price, you have no moral issues, because you can't influence reality. Mm-hmm. You don't, what you do doesn't change the market prices. But once you become influential, that your voice or your actions are imitated, influence others, so it moves markets, then you have a problem of, your personal benefit and the public good. And that does make life difficult.
Yeah. How do you balance it then for yourself?
Well, eventually I got out of the market. In other words, I'm not.
That's the best way to handle it then.
It does make it difficult. I will give you an example. When I was a small fund, I bought shares in, let's say, Northrop at the time when they were accused of bribery, and the stock collapsed. And I thought that's a good investment, and in fact it was a good investment. And in fact, I have absolutely no moral scruples about having bought that stock, because my buying it did not in any way influence what happens to Northrop. Mm-hmm. Later on, I took a public stand against or supported the banning of landmines. And I also happened to own a chunk of stock in a company that manufactures landmines. Mm-hmm. And I felt obliged to sell it. And it was against my business judgment, because actually it turned out to be a very good stock, and it was a pity that I had to sell it. But I felt that being a public person advocating abolition of landmines, I can't own shares in a company.
Right.
So that shows you the sort of moral dilemma that does arise.
Back in the 2004 election, it was quite well publicized, all the amount of money, and from your net worth, it doesn't seem to be such a huge chunk, but around 15 million, some people have said, that you put into trying to oust George Bush.
It's actually 27.5.
27.5, okay.
Right.
Do you feel at this point, one, that the money was unwisely spent since it didn't work, and the other side of that question is, why didn't it work? With all of that money and all of the criticism, why was it that, do you think, the American people still supported him?
First of all, I think the money was very well spent. It was very important to take a stance. I think that if President Bush had been not re-elected, history would have taken a different course, and we would not be in the kind of trouble that we find ourselves in. So I felt then, and I feel now, that it was absolutely the right thing to do. But you can't buy things with money. I mean, in the end, people do have a vote, and in terms of money, actually, the two parties were pretty equal. So you have to ask yourself, and I did ask myself, how come that President Bush was re-elected? And one of the sad answers that I came up with is that we don't really care about the truth. That people care about success, what works, and not what's true and what's false. So they didn't have the kind of resentment for being misled as I felt. And that, I think, is a commentary on our society. Now, you could argue that 3 months later, there was more evidence, and if the elections had been held later, it might have had more effect, so it may have been just timing. But against that argument, while people now recognize that going into Iraq was a terrible blunder, people still accept the war on terror as the frame in which we have to think about foreign policy. And in my firm judgment, the war on terror is a false metaphor that leads to counterproductive results. It achieves the opposite of what it's meant to do. It actually reinforces terrorism and creates a never-ending and escalating vicious circle of violence and repression.
Could you be wrong? Could your opinion not be accurate?
Absolutely. And because my argument is an abstract argument, and the war on terror is also an abstraction. And we need to form abstractions in order to deal with reality. But our abstractions don't correspond to reality. They are abstractions. They are distortions of reality. So I distort it one way, President Bush distorted it the other way. It's for everyone to judge. Obviously, I believe that my arguments are valid.
Well, George Soros, we are out of time. Thank you so much for sitting down with us.
Very good.
George Soros.
Good.
To order a transcript, call 866-652-3378 or send $6.95 to the address on your screen. Please include the name of the guest.